The woman on the phone said her name was Alina Voss and she was calling from the State Historical Museum's photography archive. And she wanted to know if I was, in fact, the Renata Cole who appeared in a photograph titled Harvest Light, 1994, that had just been donated to their permanent collection as part of an estate gift. I told her I didn't understand what she meant, because as far as I knew there was no photograph of me from 1994 anywhere in this world, not one, not a single frame, because my parents had spent the better part of 15 years making sure of that. She said, "Well, I have it right here in front of me. A girl maybe 7 years old standing in a wheat field at golden hour and there's a name written on the back in pencil. It says Renata, age 7, and then an address in Cedar Hollow, Iowa." My hands were shaking by the time she finished the sentence, because I grew up in Cedar Hollow, Iowa, and I was 7 years old in 1994, and I had spent my entire adult life believing that photograph, whatever photograph it might have been, simply did not exist, that I did not exist in any photographic sense for the first 15 years of my life, because every album, every frame, every school portrait that should have held my face had somehow always, conveniently, mysteriously been missing me. I should explain because I know how strange that sounds when you say it out loud to a stranger, the way I eventually had to say it out loud to Alina Voss. My name is Renata Cole. I'm the middle child of 3. My older brother Marcus is 2 years ahead of me. My younger sister Vivienne is 3 years behind. If you walked into my childhood home in Cedar Hollow at any point between roughly 1992 and 2007, and you looked at the photographs on the walls, in the albums stacked on the bookshelf in the den, in the frames on the piano nobody played, you would have seen a very complete, very well-documented family history of the Cole family. Marcus as a chubby toddler in a Halloween costume. Marcus's first day of kindergarten. Marcus's Little League team photo. His braces, his prom, his graduation, framed and reframed as he grew into each version of himself. Vivienne's baby photos, dozens of them, because Vivienne was born the year my father bought his first good camera. A Nikon he was very proud of, and there are more photographs of Vivienne's first birthday alone than there are of my entire childhood combined. And somewhere in between all of that, if you looked closely, if you really searched, you would find almost nothing of me. A handful of photos where I'm a blurry shape in the background, half out of frame, or where I'm present but small, tucked at the edge, easy to miss unless you were looking specifically for me, and I was always looking because by the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, I had started counting. I want to explain how this happens to a person because it did not happen all at once, and I think that's actually the most important part of the story, the slow accumulation of it, because if it had happened all at once, if my parents had sat me down and said, "We are choosing not to photograph you," I think I would have understood it faster, would have had something concrete to be angry about. Instead, it crept in sideways, disguised as 100 small, ordinary moments, the kind of thing that only reveals its true shape years later when you finally lay all the pieces next to each other and see the pattern they make. My father, Walter Cole, was not a cruel man in any obvious sense. He worked at a farm equipment dealership his whole life, quiet, steady, not much of a talker. My mother, Diane, ran the front office at the elementary school and was, by most accounts, a warm and involved presence in the community. She organized the school's fall festival every year. She brought casseroles to grieving neighbors. She was the kind of woman people described as such a good mother at church. This is part of what made everything so disorienting for me growing up and honestly for years afterward. The version of my parents that existed in public and even the version that existed with Marcus and Vivienne was warm and attentive. It was only in the specific, narrow channel of my own visibility, literal photographic visibility, that something went cold. The story I was eventually told, much later by my mother in a moment of rare unguarded honesty, was that I had been what she called a difficult baby. I cried more than Marcus had. I had colic for the first several months of my life that apparently drove my parents to the edge of exhaustion, a stretch of sleepless nights that, in my mother's telling, changed something between us before I was even old enough to remember it myself. She said this to me once, years later, almost apologetically, as though it explained everything, as though a few months of infant colic in 1987 could account for a decade and a half of near-total pH. Autographic erasure, it doesn't of course, but I think it was the seed. I think somewhere in that exhausted, resentful haze of new parenthood with a colicky second child, my mother formed an association. Renata is hard. Renata is a drain. Renata is the one who takes rather than gives, and that association calcified over the years into something neither of my parents ever examined out loud, but which shaped, invisibly, almost every choice they made about which moments of our family life were worth preserving. The first time I remember consciously noticing something was wrong, I was around 8 years old, going through the photo albums on a rainy Saturday, the way kids do when they're bored. I found the album from Marcus's 10th birthday party, which would have been the year I turned 8, and flipped through it looking for myself in the pictures. I remembered being at that party, remembered the bounce house in the backyard, remembered helping blow up balloons, and I could not find myself in a single photograph. Marcus front and center blowing out candles. My parents flanking him, beaming, a dozen of his friends from school. My little sister Vivienne, only 5 at the time, captured in at least 6 different shots, adorable in her overalls, sitting near the cake. Me nowhere, not blurry in the background, not cut off at the edge. Simply absent, as though I had not been at my own brother's birthday party, though I know for a fact that I was, because I remember the sunburn I got that day from standing outside too long. I brought this up to my mother, the way an 8-year-old does, without any real understanding of what I was pointing at. I said, "Mom, how come I'm not in any of the pictures from Marcus's party?" And she looked at the album for a second, a strange flicker crossing her face, and said, "Oh, you probably just stepped out of frame, honey, your dad's not the best photographer," and laughed a little and moved on to something else. I remember accepting that explanation completely, the way children accept almost anything an adult tells them with enough confidence, and I didn't think about it again for a long time. But it kept happening. Not every single time. That's an important detail, I think, because if it had been absolute and total, if there had truly been 0 photographs of me anywhere, someone might have noticed and said something long before they did. Instead, it was inconsistent enough to seem like bad luck, coincidence, the ordinary chaos of family photography, while somehow over years adding up to something that was clearly not coincidence at all. My school picture day photos existed because the school required them, and my mother, working the front office, had no real way to avoid them without it being strange. But even those had a peculiar quality to them retrospectively. While Marcus's and Vivienne's school photos were prominently displayed, framed on the wall going up our staircase in a neat chronological row, mine were kept in a drawer. I found them once, a stack of them, rubber banded together, shoved in the bottom of my mother's desk in the den, never framed, never displayed, just filed away like paperwork. By the time I was 10, I had started, almost without realizing I was doing it, to keep a kind of internal ledger. I noticed when my father brought out the Nikon at Vivienne's dance recitals, snapping dozens of shots, and left it in its bag at my own piano recitals, which I had begged to take up specifically because Marcus played guitar and got so much attention for it, and which I practiced for hours hoping someone would think it was worth capturing. I noticed that our family Christmas card, sent out every year to what felt like half the county, always seemed to feature Marcus and Vivienne prominently, with me positioned at the edge, sometimes half-cropped. Once, I found this one much later, going through old cards Vivienne had saved, entirely absent. A card from the year I was 12 that simply pictured my parents and my siblings in front of the tree, as though I had never been born. I asked about that one directly. I was old enough by then, maybe 13, to push a little harder than I had at 8. I asked my mother why I wasn't in the Christmas card from the year before, and she got flustered in a way I now recognize as guilt, though at the time I just registered it as irritation, and she said, "You must have been sick that day or at a friend's house. I don't remember every single detail, Renata. It was over a year ago." I didn't push further. I want to be honest that for most of my adolescence, I didn't push further on any of this, not because it didn't hurt. It did, in a slow, low-grade way that I didn't have language for, but because the alternative, actually confronting my parents and demanding they explain why their middle child seemed to be systematically excluded from the family's visual record, felt too enormous, too destabilizing, like pulling a th. Read that might unravel something I wasn't ready to see fully unraveled. There were specific incidents, though, that I still remember with total clarity. The kind of moments that lodge in you and don't fade the way ordinary memories do. When I was 11, our extended family gathered for my grandfather's 80th birthday, a big event at a rented hall with nearly 60 relatives, and a professional photographer had been hired to take a formal family portrait, 3 generations, arranged on risers, the whole production. I remember the photographer, a patient older man named Mr. Halloran, arranging everyone, calling out names, fitting people into rows by height. I remember standing where I'd been told to stand, between my cousin Delphine and my Aunt Ruth. And I remember my mother at the last second before the shutter clicked, reaching over and pulling me slightly out of position, saying something to Mr. Halloran about the composition being off. Could we just shift things around a touch? And in the shuffling that followed, somehow, I ended up not in that final photograph at all, stepped just behind my grandfather's shoulder, half obscured. Cropped out entirely in the final print that got framed and hung in my grandfather's hallway for the rest of his life. I stood right there. I was right there in that room in that moment, and the photograph that became the official record of it does not contain me. I didn't understand at 11 that this was a pattern with a shape and a logic. I just understood that something about me made photographs go wrong, made me disappear from documentation the way I sometimes felt I disappeared from attention generally in my own house. Marcus was the golden oldest son, good at sports, easy to be proud of in simple, legible ways. Vivienne was the baby, endlessly adorable, endlessly photographed simply by virtue of being small and cute and new. And I existed in between them, and somehow in the accounting of my family's memory making, I existed less. By the time I was in middle school, I had started to develop what I can only describe now as a complicated relationship with cameras generally. I hated having my picture taken, not because I disliked how I looked, but because some deep, unexamined part of me had learned to expect that photographs of me either wouldn't happen or wouldn't survive. And it felt safer somehow to preempt that rejection by avoiding the camera myself, ducking out of group shots at school, making excuses, developing a reputation among my friends as camera shy, which wasn't really true. It was something closer to a learned self-protection. The incident that finally, fully cracked open my understanding of what was happening came when I was 15. My mother had decided to redo the photo wall going up our staircase, the same wall that had displayed Marcus's and Vivienne's school photos in a neat chronological row for years, and she spent an entire weekend taking it apart and reorganizing it, adding new frames, updating older ones. I came home from a friend's house on the Sunday evening of that project and walked up the stairs and stopped, halfway up, staring at the finished wall. 14 photographs, beautifully framed, chronicling Marcus from infancy through his sophomore year of high school and Vivienne from infancy through 4th grade. Not one photograph of me. Not one anywhere on that wall in a house where I had lived my entire life, climbing those same stairs every single day. I stood there for a long time, I don't know how long, just looking at it, feeling something settle into place inside me with a horrible, quiet finality. Not surprise exactly, because some part of me had clearly known this was happening for years, but a kind of confirmation, the moment when a suspicion you've been holding at arm's length finally comes close enough that you can't pretend not to see its full shape anymore. I went and found my mother in the kitchen and asked her, as calmly as I could manage with my voice shaking, why there wasn't a single picture of me on the new wall. She sighed, the particular sigh of someone who's been dreading a question and is annoyed it's finally arrived, and said, "Renata, don't make this a thing. I just didn't have good recent photos of you to work with. I'll find some and add them later." She never did. I checked that wall periodically over the following 3 years until I left for college, and it never once included a photograph of me. I confronted my father about it once too, a few months after the staircase incident, catching him alone in the garage where he tinkered with an old truck engine on weekends. I asked him directly, "Why do you barely have any pictures of me? Why does it seem like you and Mom stopped photographing me for some reason?" He didn't look up from the engine for a long moment, and when he finally did, his face had an expression I'd rarely seen on him, something like discomfort mixed with a kind of practic deflection. He said, "That's your mother's department, Renata. I don't get involved in that stuff," and turned back to the engine, and that was the end of the conversation. I understood, even at 15, that this was a coward's answer, that he knew that he had watched it happen for years and simply chosen not to intervene, which felt in its own way like its own kind of quiet participation. There was another incident around that same stretch of time that I think about often, maybe because of how small and ordinary it was on its surface. My high school held a father-daughter dance every February, a fundraiser for the music program, and my father, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to take me the year I was 16. It should have been a nice night. He wore an actual tie, I wore a dress my aunt had helped me pick out, and for a couple of hours it almost felt like being an ordinary teenager with an ordinary attentive parent. There was a photo booth set up near the punch table, a local photographer hired for the evening, printing out little souvenir strips for anyone who wanted one. I dragged my father over and we posed together, 4 different silly faces, and the strip came out of the machine warm and a little crooked, and I remember feeling, holding it, something close to pure happiness, proof finally printed and physical of an evening where I had been the one who mattered. I put it on my dresser when we got home. 3 weeks later I noticed it was gone. I asked my mother if she'd seen it, and she said she'd been tidying my room and must have put it somewhere, she'd look for it. She never found it, or said she never did. I searched my own room for it periodically over the following year and never found it either. I don't know to this day what happened to that photo strip. I only know that it disappeared the same way everything else involving my visible presence in that house seemed to disappear quietly without explanation, as though some low invisible current in that home was constantly working to smooth me back out of the record. I started around 16 to develop a theory, one I never said out loud to anyone, not even my closest friend at the time, a girl named Odette who I told almost everything else to. My theory was that my mother wasn't malicious exactly, wasn't sitting up at night plotting my erasure. I didn't believe that even then. I believed something closer to what I now understand to be true, which is that unexamined resentment doesn't announce itself. It just quietly directs 1,000 small unconscious choices, whose recital gets remembered, whose accomplishment gets the good camera, whose face ends up again and again just outside the frame when the shutter clicks. I didn't have that language at 16. What I had instead was a low, persistent hum of anxiety every time a camera came out, a flinch I couldn't quite explain even to myself, bracing for the moment when I once again find some plausible, deniable reason for my own absence. I want to talk about what that does to a teenager growing up genuinely unsure whether you are wanted in your own family's story. It's not the kind of harm that shows up in bruises or in anything anyone outside the house could point to and call abuse in an obvious sense. It's slower and stranger than that. I developed, over those years, a persistent low-frequency conviction that I was somehow less real than my siblings. Not unloved exactly, because my parents did plenty of ordinary parental things, drove me to school, came to my occasional events, fed and clothed and housed me without complaint, but less documented, less celebrated, less proof of existence than Marcus and Vivienne. And there is something uniquely destabilizing about growing into adulthood with a family record that seems to suggest, photograph by missing photograph, that you were somehow not fully present for your own childhood. By the time I left for college at 18, I had made a private, unspoken decision that I would build my own life somewhere that didn't require my parents' framing to feel real. I studied art history, and then almost by accident fell in love with photography itself during an elective course my sophomore year, which I recognize now with the benefit of distance was probably not entirely accidental at all. There was something in me that needed to understand cameras, needed to understand the mechanics of what makes an image, what makes a moment worth preserving, maybe because I had spent so much of my childhood on the wrong side of that particular equation. I ended up minoring in photography, spent hours in the darkroom my university still maintained, learned to develop film myself, learned about composition and light and the strange alchemical process by which a fraction of a second becomes a permanent object that outlives the moment it captured. I moved to the city after graduation, took a job at a small gallery, eventually transitioned into freelance photography work myself, mostly weddings and family portraits, which people who don't know my history find a slightly ironic career choice and which I understand privately as something closer to a long, slow act of reclamation. Every family I photograph, I make sure every single member is in at least one frame, centered, unmistakably present. I've never told a client why I'm so particular about this. It's not their business, it's mine. My relationship with my parents through my 20s settled into a kind of careful, distant politeness. I called on holidays. I visited maybe once a year, usually for a few days around Christmas, staying in my childhood bedroom, which had over the years been slowly converted into a half-hearted guest room, my old belongings boxed up and shoved into the closet, as though the room itself had joined in the general project of my erasure. Marcus and I stayed reasonably close. He'd moved to Minneapolis and we texted regularly, and he was, I think, genuinely oblivious to most of what had happened to me growing up, the way an older sibling with a completely different experience of the same household often is. Vivienne and I were friendly but not close, separated by both age and by the strange asymmetry of our childhoods, which she had experienced as the cherished baby of the family, and I had experienced as something closer to a resident ghost. I never fully confronted my parents about the photographs, not in any sustained way, through most of my 20s. I told myself I had made peace with it, that I understood intellectually where it had come from, the colic story, the exhausted resentment of new parents, whatever unexamined psychological knot had formed in my mother sometime in 1987 and simply never got untied, and that understanding the origin was close enough to healing. I know now that wasn't true. I know now that I had simply gotten very good at not looking directly at the wound, the way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture in a dark room without quite remembering it's there. Low point, if I'm honest, came when I was 29 at my grandmother's funeral. My mother's mother, a woman named Corinne who I had actually been close to as a child. She was one of the only people in my extended family who had reliably, consistently paid attention to me, who kept her own small collection of Polaroids of just the two of us, taken on visits that she'd shown me proudly over the years, telling me I was her favorite to photograph because I had a face that told a story. After the funeral, going through my grandmother's belongings with my mother and my aunt, sorting what would be kept and what would be donated or discarded, I found a small shoebox in the back of her closet, and inside it were dozens of those Polaroids, all of me at various ages, spanning nearly 15 years, birthdays, ordinary afternoons, a rainy day when I was maybe 9 and we'd bake cookies together, all captured, all preserved by the one person in my family who had apparently decided, independently of everyone else, that I was worth documenting. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's closet holding that shoebox and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Not really about my grandmother's death, though that grief was real too, but about the specific devastating relief of finding proof, physical proof, that I had existed as a photographable, memorable child, that the absence in my parents' house had never been about me being fundamentally unworthy of the camera's attention. It had simply been about them. About whatever had broken in my mother during those exhausted early months and never got repaired. My mother found me there on the floor and looked at the shoebox in my lap, and her face went pale and she said quietly, "Your grandmother kept those." Not a question about my feelings, not an apology, just a strange, almost clinical surprise, as though the existence of documented proof of my childhood was itself the shocking part, rather than its 15-year absence everywhere else. I took that shoebox home with me. I didn't say anything more to my mother about it that day in the raw, immediate aftermath of the funeral, but something had shifted in me, quietly the way these things do, not a decision yet, not a plan, just a growing, settled certainty that I could no longer keep pretending this didn't matter, that some reckoning eventually was going to have to happen, even if I didn't yet know what shape it would take. I want to be clear that I did not spend the following several years actively searching for more evidence, building some kind of case. That's not what happened, and I think it's important to say so because what came next arrived entirely without my engineering it, which is, in its own way, the whole point of this story. I had spent so many years being systematically hidden that when the truth finally surfaced, it surfaced on its own, independent of me, proof that existed in the world whether or not my family had ever intended it to be found. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that during the summer of 1994, when I was 7 years old, my family had briefly hosted a young photography student from the state university, a woman named Josephine Alvarez, who had been doing a rural documentary project on Midwestern farm families for her senior thesis, and who had spent about 10 days that August staying in a spare room at our neighbor's farm, photographing daily life in Cedar Hollow. I have almost no memory of her at all. I would have been very young, and it was a brief visit, decades ago, but apparently, according to what Alina Voss told me on the phone, and what I later confirmed through some research of my own, Josephine Alvarez had spent an afternoon photographing children in the wheat fields near our property, capturing images of local kids playing, running, existing in that particular golden, unposed way children do when they don't know they're being documented for posterity. One of those photographs was of me. Josephine Alvarez went on to have a modest but respected career as a documentary photographer, working mostly on agricultural and rural life projects across the Midwest for the following 3 decades. She died 2 years ago, and her estate, including a substantial archive of negatives and prints spanning her entire career, was donated to the State Historical Museum, which had spent the last 2 years cataloging the collection, identifying subjects where possible, working toward an exhibition. Harvest Light, 1994. A photograph of a 7-year-old girl standing alone in a wheat field at golden hour, her arms slightly outstretched, her face turned up toward a low August sun, an image that Alina Voss described to me when I finally saw it myself as one of the most striking images in the entire collection, had been identified through the handwritten note on its back as depicting a girl named Renata, age 7, at an address in Cedar Hollow, Iowa. The museum's research team had done some basic tracing, found that the address corresponded to my childhood home, found a Renata Cole associated with public records tied to that address, and Alina Voss had called me on a Tuesday afternoon in March to ask if I might be willing to come see the photograph and possibly consent to it being included, credited, in an upcoming retrospective exhibition of Josephine Alvarez's work. I drove out to see it in person the following week. I remember standing in the climate-controlled archive room of the museum, a quiet, carpeted space that smelled faintly of preservation chemicals, while Alina Voss carefully removed the print from its protective sleeve and set it on a viewing table under soft, even light, and I looked down at a photograph of myself at 7 years old that I had never seen before in my life, that had existed, entirely without my family's knowledge or involvement, in an archive 300 miles away, waiting decades to resurface. I looked exactly like myself. That's a strange thing to say, but it's true. There was something in the photograph, in the specific tilt of my head, the particular expression on my face, that I recognized immediately as unmistakably, essentially me, in a way that felt almost eerie given how few images of my childhood self I'd ever had access to. I stood there for a long time just looking at it, and Alina Voss, sensing something in my silence, asked gently if I was all right, and I told her honestly that this was the first photograph I had ever seen of myself before the age of 15 that hadn't come from a school picture day or my grandmother's shoebox. She looked at me with an expression of genuine confusion, and I found myself in that quiet archive room explaining the whole thing to a stranger for the first time in my life. Not in the careful, deflecting way I'd occasionally alluded to it with close friends over the years, but the full, unvarnished shape of it, the missing birthday photographs, the staircase wall, the Christmas card, my grandmother's shoebox, all of it spilling out of me in that room because something about seeing my own 7-year-old face, captured by a stranger's camera in a wheat field decades ago, had finally given me permission to say the whole truth out loud without flinching. Alina Voss listened to all of it, and when I finished, she said something that I've thought about often since. She said, "Well, whatever your family chose not to preserve, someone else thought you were worth capturing." And now this image is going to hang in a museum permanently as part of the historical record of this state. Whatever else is true, you can't be erased from that. The museum offered to feature Harvest Light 1994 as one of the centerpiece images in the upcoming Josephine Alvarez retrospective, a major exhibition scheduled to open that autumn with an accompanying wall text identifying the subject and briefly describing the rediscovery. They asked my permission, which felt significant in itself. After a childhood of never being consulted about my own visibility, here was an institution formally asking whether I consented to being seen. I said yes without hesitation. I didn't tell my parents about any of this at first. I sat with it privately for several weeks, turning it over, trying to understand what I wanted to do with it, if anything. Part of me wanted to simply let it exist quietly, my own private vindication, proof I could hold on to without needing anyone else's acknowledgement. But another part of me, the part that had spent 15 years standing at the edges of photographs, cropped out of family portraits, absent from staircase walls, wanted something more, wanted the people who had done this to me to have to sit with the fact of it, undeniably, in a way they couldn't deflect or minimize the way my mother had deflected the staircase, the way my father had deflected in the garage. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in October. I invited my parents along with Marcus and Vivienne without explaining much beyond telling them there was a photograph of me in a museum exhibit and I wanted them to see it. I think curiosity, more than anything, was what got them to actually show up. My mother, I suspect, could not quite process the idea of a photograph of me existing that she'd never seen, and some old habitual anxiety about being caught out drove her to want to see it for herself before anyone else in the family did. We walked through the exhibition together, an unusual, tense little procession, my parents, Marcus, Vivienne, and me, moving past dozens of Josephine Alvarez's photographs of rural Midwestern life, until we reached the section near the back of the gallery where Harvest Light 1994 hung enlarged to nearly 4 feet tall, lit beautifully, my 7-year-old face turned up toward that long-ago August sun, with a small placard beside it that read, Renata Cole, age 7, Cedar Hollow, Iowa, rediscovered and identified 2025. My mother stopped walking. I watched her face as she looked up at that photograph, and I saw something move through her expression that I had genuinely never seen before in all my years of watching her. Not embarrassment exactly, not even guilt in its purest form, but something closer to grief. A kind of stricken recognition, as though she was seeing for the first time laid bare in 4 feet of gallery-lit clarity, the actual scale of what she had chosen not to preserve. My father stood beside her, silent, his jaw working, and Marcus, who truly hadn't known any of the backstory, turned to me with genuine confusion and asked, "Wait, is this the only baby picture of you that exists? I thought there were albums full of this stuff." And I told him, standing right there in that gallery in front of my parents, the whole truth plainly, the way I'd told Alina Voss weeks earlier, that there were, as far as I knew, almost no photographs of me anywhere in our family's records before I turned 15. That this stranger's photograph, taken by a documentary student who happened to wander through our fields one August afternoon in 1994, was very possibly the only professionally preserved image of my early childhood that existed anywhere in the world outside a shoebox my grandmother had kept secretly in her closet. Vivienne looked genuinely shaken. She'd grown up seeing her own baby pictures everywhere, framed, celebrated, and I don't think it had ever fully occurred to her until that exact moment, standing in front of that enlarged photograph, that her own visual abundance had existed alongside my near-total absence. She said quietly, "I didn't know it was that bad, Renata. I mean, I knew there weren't a lot of pictures of you around, but I thought that was just, I don't know, I never really thought about why." My mother didn't say much, standing there. She reached out at one point and touched the edge of the placard very lightly with one finger as though checking that it was real, and then she said in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard her use, "I didn't know anyone photographed you that summer. I don't even remember that woman staying at the Hendersons' place." And then, after a long pause, she said, "You look so happy in this picture." And something about that specific observation, not an apology, not yet, just a simple, almost wondering statement about my own happiness, captured by a stranger, on a day she had no memory of, seemed to finally crack something open in her that 15 years of careful avoidance had kept sealed. We didn't have the full conversation there in the gallery, surrounded by strangers admiring other photographs. But that evening, back at my parents' house after Marcus and Vivienne had gone to bed, my mother came and found me in the kitchen where I was getting a glass of water before he dang up to my old room, and she said, "Can we talk?" And we sat at that same kitchen table where she'd once told me not to make the staircase wall into a thing. And this time, finally, without deflection, without the sigh of someone annoyed at being questioned, she told me the truth as she understood it. The colic, yes, the exhaustion, yes, but also something deeper and uglier that she admitted to for the first time, which was that somewhere in those hard early months, she had developed a kind of low-grade resentment toward me that she never fully examined or processed. And that resentment had curdled over years into an unconscious habit of simply not prioritizing me the way she prioritized Marcus and Vivienne. Not out of any single cruel decision, she said, but out of 1,000 small choices, each one individually justifiable, each one adding up over 15 years. Into something she could no longer pretend was accidental once she saw it laid out in a museum for the whole state to see. She cried. My father, who came into the kitchen partway through, stood in the doorway for a long time before finally sitting down too, and admitted in his own halting way that he had known on some level for years that something was wrong, and had simply let my mother's discomfort dictate the household's silence rather than push against it, because pushing against things had never been his way, and that this passivity, he now understood, had been its own form of participation in what happened to me. I won't pretend that one conversation, however raw and honest, undid 15 years of erasure. It didn't. Healing from something like that isn't a single scene, it's a slow, ongoing labor, and I'm still, even now, working through what it means to have grown up believing myself less real, less worth capturing than my siblings. But something did shift permanently that October. My mother started, in the months that followed, doing something I never expected. She began going through old family friends, neighbors, anyone who might have taken photographs at gatherings I'd attended as a child, asking if they had anything with me in it, slowly, painstakingly assembling a kind of retroactive record, framed copies of which she mailed to me periodically with short notes attached, sometimes just a single line. Found this one from your cousin's wedding, you were 9, you're smiling at something off camera, wish I remembered what. The museum exhibition ran for 4 months, and Harvest Light 1994 became, according to Alina Voss, one of the most commented on pieces in the entire retrospective. Something about the unguarded, luminous quality of a child photographed without awareness of the camera resonating with visitors in a way the more composed, deliberate images in the collection didn't quite match. I went back to see it several more times during its run, sometimes alone, standing in that quiet gallery looking up at my 7-year-old self bathed in that long-ago August light. And each time I felt a little more of the old ache loosen, not because a photograph could undo what had been done, but because it existed, undeniably, permanently, in a public record my family could never again pretend away. I bought a print of it eventually, a smaller version the museum offered as part of a limited run tied to the exhibition catalog, and I hung it in my own apartment in the hallway at eye level, the first thing I see when I come home. It feels some days like the truest kind of homecoming I could have asked for, not my parents' staircase wall, not the family Christmas card, but a stranger's careful attention, preserved by chance, waiting decades to find its way back to me. In the weeks after the exhibition opened, word of the photograph and its odd little backstory started circulating quietly through Cedar Hollow itself, the way any mildly newsworthy thing does in a town that small. A reporter from the regional paper called me, having heard about it from someone at the museum, and asked if I'd be willing to talk about the rediscovery for a short feature on the Alvarez retrospective. I agreed cautiously and spent an hour on the phone with her describing the photograph, the archive, the strange sensation of seeing my own 7-year-old face for the first time as an adult. I did not in that interview go into the full history of what it meant, the missing staircase photos, the vanished dance strip, my grandmother's shoebox that felt like it belonged to my family, not to a newspaper. But the piece ran with a photo of me standing beside the enlarged print, and a caption identifying me as the subject. And I know for a fact that half the people who had known my parents for decades saw it, because my mother told me a little sheepishly that she'd fielded several calls from old neighbors and church friends asking with poorly disguised curiosity how they'd never known there was a photograph of me like that. I don't know exactly what she told them. I didn't ask. Some things I decided I was allowed to let go of, to not need to control or witness every angle of. My grandmother's shoebox came up again that winter in an unexpected way. I had kept it, of course, since the day I found it on her closet floor, and around the holidays that year I finally sat down and had it professionally archived, had the Polaroid scanned, reprinted where the originals had started to fade, and put together a small photo book, just for myself, spanning the 15 Polaroids my grandmother had quietly, faithfully taken of me over the years she'd known me. I gave a copy to my mother that Christmas, not as an accusation, just as a fact laid gently on the table between us. This is what existed this whole time, kept by someone who decided on her own without needing anyone's permission that I mattered enough to keep a record of. My mother cried when she opened it. She has kept that book on her own coffee table ever since, the first object with my face on it that has ever occupied a visible place in that house. I think too about Vivienne and the slow, careful way our relationship has shifted since that day in the gallery. She reached out to me a few months later unprompted and told me she'd started going through old photo albums herself on her own initiative, trying to find any image where I might be present even at the edges, cropped or blurred or half turned away, just to compile whatever fragments actually existed. She found nine photographs across 15 years where some sliver of me had survived at the margin of a frame meant for someone else. She sent me digital scans of all 9 with a message that just said, "I'm sorry I never noticed before, I want you to have these." It wasn't a grand gesture, it didn't undo anything. But it was, I think, the first time in either of our lives that Vivienne had actively looked for me rather than simply existing, unknowingly, in the abundant light I'd spent my whole childhood standing just outside of. My father and I talk more now than we ever did before, small, halting conversations, usually over the phone on Sunday evenings, usually about nothing in particular, his truck, the weather, some minor happening at the equipment dealership where he still works part-time. It isn't much. But he calls now, which he never used to do, and once a few months after the exhibition, he told me in his characteristically brief way that he'd started keeping a disposable camera in the glove compartment of his truck, in case something worth remembering happens, and that he'd already used up 2 rolls since the fall. He didn't say it was about me specifically. He didn't have to. I think often about how close that photograph came to never surfacing at all, how easily it could have stayed in a box in Josephine Alvarez's archive forever, undiscovered, and how strange it is that the proof of my own childhood ended up depending on someone entirely outside my family choosing, on an ordinary August afternoon in 1994, to lift a camera and decide that I was worth the frame. I try not to dwell too much on the unfairness of that, the fact that it took a stranger's instinct to see what my own parents, for whatever tangled reasons of their own, couldn't manage to see for 15 years. Instead, I try to hold on to what came after, the slow rebuilding, the framed photographs that keep arriving in the mail, my mother's careful, imperfect attempts to make up for lost time in the only currency she has left to offer. It doesn't erase what happened. But it means something that she's trying now finally to put me back into the record of our family's life, one recovered photograph at a time, the way she should have been doing all along. And it means something too that I no longer need her to. I spent so many years believing that being seen required someone else's permission, someone else's camera, someone else's decision, that I was worth the frame. What that wheat field photograph taught me in the end wasn't just that I had once existed visibly, undeniably, at 7 years old under an August sun. It was that I get to decide now who gets to hold the camera in my life going forward, and I no longer hand it automatically to people who might let me slip out of frame.